Okay, everyone, welcome to episode 66, lucky number 66. Puffy, who's number 66 out on the ice?
There's only one 66 GCAT when it comes to hockey. The great Mario Lemieux. I have to say, I grew up as a Wayne fan. I was not a Mario guy. I think you were probably in either camp. Like, it's either loved Mario or you loved Wayne. But my appreciation for Lemieux's game over the years has grown. I can't remember one of the guys I worked with. He was talking to a scout who was scouting Mario Lemieux when he was playing in juniors, and he went to the game and he came back. He said, "So how did he play last night?" He's like, "He wasn't very good. He kind of floats. He just didn't look as good as I thought he did." And then the guy asked, "How many points did he add?" And he had 7. So even when he was not at his best, he absolutely dominated. He was a man among boys. For a guy who wasn't known for being like the most physical player as far as body checks and fighting and stuff like that, anyone who played against him said his strength was just outrageous. He would just push you aside like you weren't even there. And he had the hands of a surgeon.
Is he still involved in hockey?
Not really. He owned the Pittsburgh Penguins. It was a great deal for him. They couldn't afford to pay him, so they gave him the team. And then he turned that and sold that to what's it called? The FSG Group, who owns the Red Sox, Fenway Sports Group. I think they made like $900 million on it. So he did quite well. But I haven't heard anything. This was a few years ago. Anything about his involvement with the NHL or the team or whatever since he sold, which was a few years ago now. But great hockey player and a great hockey guy.
Yeah, good. All right. Well, there you go. Mario Lemieux, number 66. So today's episode is a great interview episode that we have lined up for everybody today. We have a gentleman named Scott Campbell, who is many people would know from around Ted Reeve Rink, as he is a coach of the U7 team there, or the U8 Tornadoes,
Yep.
Who are an experimental team that is trying some things that are allowing them to go into tournaments and being more of a tournament team this year. Sounds like they have a great bunch of young players on that team. He's also a scout for the Soo Greyhounds in the OHL. And he also works at one of the places we all like to go, where we spend lots of money and time, which is Canlan Sports, where he's very involved. So Scott is the trifecta of sports involvement and hockey involvement with Canlan, OHL, and the Ted Reeve Tornadoes U8 heading, a couple more years into the G. So we had a great interview with him, wealth of knowledge, very knowledgeable guy, knew lots of things going on. And so why don't we throw to the interview with Mr. Scott Campbell. Today on To the Rink, we're thrilled to welcome Scott Campbell to the podcast. Scott wears a lot of hats in the hockey world. First, as the director of North American programs with Canlan Sports, where he oversees leagues, tournaments, and camps all over Canada and the U.S. When he's not shaping the game at the macro level, he's scouting for the Soo Greyhounds in the OHL, where he's been for 7 years, and he's previously worked with the Sudbury Wolves and the Oshawa Generals. And if it wasn't enough, Scott's out on the ice coaching U8 Tornadoes, the red team in particular, and helping out with the U7 House League teams at Ted Reeve. He's a hockey guy through and through, and we can't wait to dive into his story. So welcome, Scott. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, guys. Much appreciated.
Yeah, good to have you. We've been trying to have you on for a few weeks, but scheduling hasn't allowed it. So we're really happy to have you tonight. So while we kick off, I know I did a little intro there, but why don't you just give everybody just a little bit of introduction to yourself and your interactions with hockey?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of covered it off the bat. It's been a big part of my life for the better part of 20 plus years, especially now. There's not many days in a week that I'm not in a rink. I spend a lot of time in very cold rinks watching U16 hockey and some U15 and U18 hockey. And most recently, over the past few years, as my little guys have started to grow up, we supplement that with some riveting U8 and U6 hockey now as well.
That's great. That's great. So you live in Toronto, but in the intro, I know you're a scout for the Soo Greyhounds. But so before I go into any sort of the questions I have, so are you up in the Soo often then? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a question people ask me a lot. We don't spend a lot of time in Sault Ste. Marie. We go up typically at the start of the year for training camp. We typically go up and do the draft there. There's been a couple drafts that we've actually facilitated in the GTA, though. Most of our crew is kind of based in Southern Ontario or in Michigan as well. And typically I'll go up for rookie camp as well, which happens usually shortly after the draft, depending on how your team's doing in the playoffs. So not too many trips up to the Soo during the season. Usually try to catch the team when we're down on a swing. Actually missed them tonight. I've had a little bit of a run of bad luck being there in person, so we tried to change up the juju. So I was not there in Peterborough tonight, but the Greyhounds did pull out a little 7-0 win tonight. So I guess I'll have to continue that streak of missing games in person. But for the most part, we're obviously watching, players with the intent on finding future Greyhounds, not so much focusing on our current team. That's more of what our hockey ops crew and the coaching staff's doing on a day-to-day basis there.
That's pretty cool. So with the Soo Greyhounds, and just, I think it's new for a lot of people that listen to our podcast. I know it's new for us in terms of the scouting process. So, I think it's a really interesting part of what you do and how you do it. So, what's the first thing you're looking for in young players when you're scouting for the Greyhounds? How do you identify potential players beyond necessarily like just the stats you see? Like, give us a little bit of the inside scoop on that.
Yeah, I think every team now has kind of their nuances in terms of what their evaluation process looks like. We have sort of a slate of tools that we're evaluating in each player, and we have a sort of rating index that we evaluate based off of. We've had a lot of continuity with our scouting group as well. So year to year, it's helpful in the sense that you're looking at a lot of precedents. You're constantly looking at players who have developed on a curve similar to what you projected. And more importantly, I think you spend a lot of time focusing on players that you're wrong about and trying to correct your scouting process and your evaluation process going forward to make you a better scout tomorrow. It's kind of always cliche, but, I think in this era particularly, we might talk about this a little bit. I think a lot of people are so focused on like the skills element, and obviously skill is incredibly important, but it's the competitiveness and your ability to process the game at a high level that ultimately makes the difference. You probably see it in any level of minor hockey, and you see it in the OHL as well. You probably see it in the NHL, where there's guys who look phenomenal in practice, but then the game starts and you kind of wonder, like, where is that player? Like, where was that player we saw in practice? That's constantly what you're looking for. You're looking at, for the guy who, who's a gamer and who ultimately, when you're in high leverage moments in, either big games during the regular season or in the playoffs, who are the guys that are going to be able to elevate their game? And maybe they're not, the most graceful, or they maybe don't seemingly have as elite of tools as some other guys, but there's sort of just those intangible elements that you really try to hone in on. Those players are obviously rare, and sometimes, they go very high in the drafts. So you don't even have a chance to pick them necessarily, but you're always kind of looking for certain things. And I think over the course of time, you see different teams start to establish patterns to how they draft. I think a lot of people would look at our organization and say, you look at some guys and be like, oh yeah, that's a Soo Greyhound. Yeah, I could see those guys picking them. We do the same with other teams as well. And it's part of the fun of it, because you kind of get to see at the end of the day, who's right, who's wrong. What does the player development process look like? Those are the questions and answers that happen over a long-term period that make it so exciting and so interesting to be a part of.
Now, Scott, so you were talking about how you guys really look at the competitiveness of players. And the GTHL, certainly at the AAA level, have a lot of very talented players and a lot of very talented teams. Would you say it's better for a player to be playing on a weaker team in the GTHL, but playing against those top competition kids, or playing maybe on a team outside of the GTHL at that level, but maybe not playing as much competition, but playing in more competitive games?
Yeah, it's kind of the $1 million question. And it's one of those questions where someone will do something and it works out and it'll be like, yep, that was the perfect decision. But on another roll of the dice, they could make the exact same decision and it doesn't work out. And then you kind of have regrets about, oh, how could this have played out another way? My philosophy is, I mean, I've lived in Toronto for 12, 13 years now. But I grew up kind of in the OMHA and the Alliance. I'm a big believer in good cream rises to the top. It doesn't really matter where you play, honestly, at the end of the day. There's no shortage of precedent of guys who have played for OMHA programs and Alliance programs and gone on to be exceptional players in junior hockey and the NHL. There's also no shortage of precedents of, kids moving around, not just in Toronto, but people coming into Toronto from outside of the GTHL boundaries to play here and having good careers. I think it really comes down to each kind of family in terms of what they think. I think the most important thing is a lot of people I find are like overthink it and think like, oh, I have to play here and I have to play on this team. Otherwise I won't get the level of exposure that I need to get to the next level. And honestly, that just couldn't be further from the truth. Like every single OHL team is looking in every nook and cranny to find players. Every person is seeing every Alliance team multiple times, every OMHA team multiple times. You look this year, like Niagara's got a good team. Barry's got a couple, really interesting players. York Simcoe, Oakville. You go on the Alliance here in Perth won, the Silver Stick this year in U16. People are watching these teams religiously. And, I think that some people overthink it and they start to get in their own heads a little bit about, we got to play here to get to the next level. Sometimes you have other voices in there being like, oh, you need to push yourself harder and play against better players. Sometimes for some of these kids, you stay local in your hometown, and go play for here on Perth. You're going to have to elevate guys around you. You have to make them better to be able to play against these big teams. And, when you see these teams line up against, sort of big time GTHL teams in the biggest tournaments of the year, they're great hockey games. And weirdly, you find that the level of competition there's a ton of parity. And, I think it's probably one of the flaws of the minor hockey development system right now where, even when I look at my oldest guy sort of in U8, everybody seems to be on this race to like, we got to be the best at like age 10 or we got to be the best at age 12. By the time you get to age 15, like the speed evens out a lot. Obviously there's guys who have elite tools that are difference makers, but the average is so finite in terms of differentiation. And that's where it starts to become, how competitive are you? How physical are you? How gritty are you? How are you able to process the game quickly in high leverage moments to make creative plays? And honestly, you can play anywhere and sort of get to that level. If you're good enough, you'll figure it out. And, I think that's a really important, that's my philosophy on it anyways. I understand that a lot of people have different opinions on that. But I think for anybody listening who maybe is thinking about, should I go to this team because it's going to help get me to the next level? If your kid's good enough and you're putting them in the right position where the framework is there for them to be successful, ultimately they themselves are going to be determining factors of, do they have the drive? Because you can't give it to them. You can't create it for them. It's in a lot of ways, it's intrinsic to kids. Right.
No, that's good counsel. I think that's very good. Yeah, that's good insight. I mean, I know it's the parents, right? Like ultimately it's parent pressure, right? 100%. Like is where it all sits. We live and breathe it. All three of us have children in hockey, and you can, that's where the parent dynamic comes in on like, what team should I be on? Should we switch to this team? Should we go to this coach? Should we play with these players? All those kinds of things. So, no, it's good insight. I think that's a refreshing story for most parents listening, that you're comfortable where you are. If you're going to break through, you're going to break through where you are. And, the journey will go on its own with your kid if it's meant to be, and if it's meant to take you on certain areas, and that's great to know. So you mentioned, when you're talking about some of the players you've been, you've scouted and looked at, and that, you said, where was that player in practice? That player looked great in practice, but where was that player in the game in practice? Do you have any great scouting stories? Again, because I think this is a unique role that you have, where a player you believed in proved you didn't believe in, proved you wrong, or vice versa. Is there any sort of good sort of story you have from your scouting time and someone who's done something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say as an organization and as an individual, we're very comfortable eating humble pie on guys, and there's certainly a lot of players around the Ontario Hockey League that you're wrong on. And when we look at how maybe I evaluated them or perceived them in their draft year and how they wound up developing as a player, you sort of have to look back and say, why is that the case? I always looked at a guy like Zane Prek, for instance, with Saginaw, where unbelievably talented player, didn't have a ton of defensive layers to his game in U16, despite being a defenseman. Really questioned whether or not he was going to be able to make up for those gaps in the Ontario Hockey League. Wound up being a first-round pick. Obviously there's still some lingering questions about now, can he do that in the NHL level? It's funny how those questions never really go away.
Hockey Canada didn't believe he could do it at the World Junior level. Sure,
exactly. But and then you're in a position where he puts up 90 points as a 17-year-old defenseman. There's been, I think, one of the toughest things being a scout in the Ontario League is that you can't trade picks, right? So there's been, in recent drafts, and I'm not going to necessarily name any names here, but there's been guys that I've been incredibly high on, and you feel like you're really early to the party at the start of the year. And you're like, yeah, if we're picking 16, we should have a good shot of this guy being there. And after the Silver Stick, and then after the Marlies tournament, and then once the GTHL playoffs get going, or, the OMHA and Alliance playoffs get going, you kind of just see it slipping through. It's like, this guy's going 8, we're not going to get a sniff of him. You don't have the luxury in the OHL draft of actually moving up, which is, one of the unfortunate frustrations of it, but those are stories. Yeah, go ahead.
You're not able to trade draft picks. I thought you could trade draft picks.
You can trade picks up until the trade deadline. There's a window that opens before the draft where you can trade picks in the second round or later. You cannot trade first round picks in the OHL priority selection.
Oh,
no.
Okay.
And so you can't trade a pick at all. And you also can't do hey, we're going to give you our first rounder plus something else to get your first rounder. There's absolutely no movement of a first round pick through a trade transaction. So as much as it's a draft, it's also a bit of a crapshoot where you could be like, hey, we love this guy. And if there's any world where we could trade up 6 picks to get him, we would do that any day of the week. You kind of have to just hope in some instances that guys slip through to you. And that's where sometimes it's fun, but it can be gutting when you sit there on draft day and, you really hope that a scenario is going to play out and you kind of just watch it fall off the table really quickly. Yes. So you really have to be dialed in with, plan A, B, C, D. You can go down the alphabet a little bit. And then, there's also a euphoria too where, kind of those 2 picks before and you're like, oh, is this guy going to get to our pick? And then they do. And you're like, it's certainly a euphoric moment when that happens as well. So I would say, to go answer the original question, honestly, one of the great stories that probably hasn't been told very often is during the COVID draft with the 05 birth year. They obviously had probably the jankiest OHL draft in history because they didn't get a season at all. Andrew Gibson, who we took in the 4th round, played for Windsor. Only a couple of us had seen him really at all in Bantam just by happenstance. And then there's limited video on these guys. You're watching just random video, wherever you could scrape together video. You're trying to get looks at these guys. His dad put together a video of him working out on a playground because the gyms were closed. And, if that video ever circulates, I'm sure guys would give him a hard time about it. But, we were like, this guy's like a 6'3" defenseman, Doesn't really seem like there's a lot of love for him. Nobody's really seen any of these guys. We thought we could kind of get him in the 4th round, but you just had no idea. We did, and it ended up working out quite well. He became a 2nd-round NHL draft pick. Went to the World Junior team this year. We just recently moved him to Oshawa for kind of a chance to play for a real league contender this year in his last year in the Ontario League. And there's just little stories like that every year. But I think that COVID draft in particular, if you asked any scout from any team, they'd probably have a little soliloquy about just weird things about where they were trying to find video or get a read on a player. And, now we're 4 years past that draft, and it's funny to look back on that and just see, where things went right and where things went wrong. And it's kind of interesting because if you look back, and I'm not even just talking about our team because I think we had a pretty good 05 draft, but if you look around the league, it kind of stacked up fairly well. It's not like it was just a complete dartboard there in the early rounds. Most of the players that kind of went early are good players as 19-year-olds.
So you talked earlier just about how parents sometimes feel pressure to have their kids on the right team at a really young age. When do scouts at an OHL level realistically start actually looking at these players? Is it only that minor midget year? Is it the U15, or are they looking at these kids even earlier than that?
I would say for most scouts, it's U16. I think that, a number of people start to take a look in U15. For me personally, I'll keep rough tabs. And then usually in the second half of the season, I try to kind of see every GTHL team once or twice. And maybe I'll see a few more, a couple more times beyond that. But you're not really putting a lot of stock in U15. You're just starting to build the narrative. What's this kid's physicality? What's their frame look like in U15? So you can kind of track, hey, did they grow a lot versus last year? Were they really big in U15 and sort of dominated because of that? And maybe they plateau size-wise, and now their game isn't as dominant in U16. You're just trying to look for kind of high-level inferences on that note. So it's really mostly U16. And I think that that's where there's misalignment, where I think a lot of parents think that every year is so critically important. And the reality is you see this happen all the time in U16, where kids start to pop or a kid grows and people are like, well, this kid wasn't good 3 years ago. How could they be good now? And it's nobody cares. Nobody cares what they were 3 years ago. People are very hung up on what spring team do you play on? Did you go to the Brick? Yeah. To be honest, we might look at something like that just to almost we'll pull up elite prospects and okay, let's look at the Brick team and see which of these kids are still kind of, notable prospects and which ones of them fell off. You're not looking at it and being hey, because this kid played in the Brick, we got to make sure we get him. We got to make sure we don't miss him. You're looking at it, as you look at them as 15-year-olds. You don't really care where they played U9 or U12. You want to see what is this player like right now, and how do we see their game as being projectable over the next 4 years. Yeah. So I think with agents, they're starting to increasingly kind of infiltrate earlier age groups, trying to sort of build relationships and secure player, commitments as sort of advisors or in an agent capacity at earlier age groups. But from a scouting perspective, nobody's watching U14 or anything like that.
Yeah. Okay. Good to know. So I still got a chance. I still got a chance. So, Scott, you've worked with the Sudbury Wolves, you've worked with the Oshawa Generals, and now you're working with the Soo Greyhounds. How have the players, and over that time, I guess that you've been doing that, has there been an evolution of how you scout or what you're looking for in that time frame? I know you talked about the U5 league and stuff, or the U5 year. Has it evolved, and does it constantly evolve? And what are those things that are evolving, if they are?
Yeah, I think it's subtle. I think it's more a matter of you kind of start to make adjustments based off of your team dynamic. So, I think a lot of teams in the OHL start to have sort of identities and styles of play that transcend age cohorts. So obviously we know in junior hockey, players age out, right? It's not like you don't draft Sidney Crosby and get him for 20 years. You get some of these players for 2 years or 3 years or 4 or 5 at most. So you have to...
Scott, 1 second. Is there tanking in the OHL?
I wouldn't really say so, honestly. I think it's more just like that's the cycle. I don't think anybody really tries to actively tank. There's a full draft lottery at the bottom, and because 16 of the 20 teams make the playoffs, and there's certainly financial motivations in the league to make the playoffs, from the sense that a lot of teams are kind of roughly a break-even operation in the regular season. So to make the playoffs is where you start to actually make your money. There's certainly a lot of vested interest to make the playoffs. So I wouldn't say there's really like tanking. Like we're not talking like the NBA here. And I'm an NBA fan, so I can say that. Yeah. But to go back to the original kind of comment, I think you make subtle changes. Like I think my first year with the Greyhounds was the 03 draft year. And, from 03s to now with the 09s, we still have an identity and a style. Like we want to play fast. We want to move the puck quick. We need D that can make intelligent decisions. Like there's certain traits that we're always going to be looking for our team, and many other teams are probably going to want similar traits. But you sort of start to take nuances. Like you might have a team that's really big and you're like, we need to get a little quicker. So we might need to like change what type of player we're looking for. Or you might have a team that's a little bit undersized and you're like, we got to get some bigger guys in here to like balance the lineup a little bit. Or, you might say we're, going to take BPA, like best player available. And that's, I think, what most teams do. But you might say in a certain draft, like, hey, this draft's a little bit stronger with forwards. We got to make sure we get, some of these guys in each of these groups that we've identified. So there's subtle, I think, nuances and changes year over year. But I don't think that, at least in my time in organizations, I don't think you ever just fully like pull a U-turn or a 180 on like where you want to sort of build your team from a philosophical standpoint. I think it's just about making subtle tweaks as the years go by.
Now, Scott, with the NCAA now opening up for OHL kids, is that making a big change in the type of play or the reach you guys now have, the players available? Because now these kids who maybe would have just gone to play in the OJHL where they could be eligible to play in the NCAA, now they're going to become more in your pool. Does that make it more difficult to kind of have to expand who you're actually going after, or does it make it easier?
Probably both, honestly. I think you have to definitely invest a lot more time and resources into the United States. There's a lot of kids now that want to come play in the Ontario Hockey League. And in recent drafts, we've seen a lot of players, want to go to the BCHL or sign a tender in the USHL, even like some of these Ontario-born kids. I think a lot of that gamesmanship kind of goes away overnight. I think a lot of people, with the table stakes being equal, the OHL is sort of the best junior hockey league that everyone wanted to play in. So by removing the barrier that you couldn't go to the NCAA, that sort of changed things overnight. And I think you can see it by looking at a transaction page of all of the players who started signing in short unison. It's definitely going to challenge teams to like do a better job of evaluating the United States. I think we've always been a team that has had American players. We have a really, really good scout in the United States as well. And a number of us make several trips to the US and try to, key in on players. Sue's also on the border. It's, not too far from Detroit. You play a lot of games in Flint, Windsor, Saginaw and stuff. So it's always been like an attractive place for Michigan kids to play. But yeah, now we're in a position where all of a sudden Americans want to come play in the Ontario League. It's going to, I think the realities of it will be that it's going to make it a more difficult pyramid for a lot of Ontario kids to get into. So obviously still going to be a ton of Ontario kids playing in the OHL. But, there's all of a sudden going to be a lot of American kids that want to come play in the league as well, which is going to improve the caliber of the league. It's going to cause some trickle-down adjustments. You're already starting to see it where the BCHL has lost players. You're starting to see some players come back to the OJ because, maybe they don't need to move away from home anymore. They just say, hey, if this league's going to sort of lose a notch of luster, maybe we just come back and play closer to home. So it's going to probably take 2, maybe 3 years for like the dust to sort of fully settle on everything here. But it's a really positive change. I went to school in the United States, very familiar with like the entire concept of the NCAA. I've long been an advocate, not that I have a huge platform, that, I don't understand why, CHL players are not eligible to play in the NCAA. And I think it sort of took for the entire name, image, and likeness movement to happen for the walls to sort of crumble in, where, all it took was sort of one lawsuit to say, hey, if a quarterback can be making, $3 million, how am I a professional if I played one exhibition game, for the North Bay Battalion? So the walls came crumbling pretty quickly there.
Yeah.
Shifting gears, I want to shift gears over to you're part of a large organization that is a big part of the GTHL, which is the Canlan Sports facilities, which are everywhere, big facilities, everyone knows them, and a big part of the daily hockey. And so that's an awesome role you have there. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your role at Canlan and what that is there too?
Yeah, I've been with Canlan for almost 13 years now. It's a really, really fascinating organization to work for. We have locations across Canada, and we've got a cluster of buildings in Chicago as well. It's an interesting industry. I think a lot of people think that they know the ice rink business. But there's a lot of layers and nuances to it. You really get sort of dialed in on the concepts of, surface utilization. And, for us, like a big part of our ethos at Canlan is that we run a lot of in-house programming. So whether that's instructional programs for Learn to Skate, instructional programs for kids to get better, we really try to focus on like the recreational level of hockey players with our own programs. We're less focused on the top of the pyramid, the elite kids. We're more focused on how do we get more people into skating as an activity and transitioning them into the game of hockey. And that sprinkles right through into our Adult Safe Hockey League, who, usually I don't have to go far to find somebody who's at least played in the ASHL, if not is a current player. We've got large enterprise programming. Like right now, we've got more than 2,000 kids in Learn to Skate programs this winter. Across the board, we have 42,000 players that play in the ASHL every year, unique players. It's like a decent sized town of rec hockey players if we pull them all together. There's nuances across the board. We work with a lot of high profile organizations, whether it's like the Toronto Marlies of the world. We work with a lot of sort of A and AA organizations, not just in Toronto, but in Chicago, Saskatoon, and the Lower Mainland as well. So, really fascinating place to work. I think we've done a good job, I want to say, in the last few years of kind of painting our narrative as being more than just like a place to rent ice. We've certainly been investing a lot of money back into our buildings to ensure that they sort of are maintained as first-class assets and great places to come watch a game, get free Wi-Fi, get a beer if you want. There's a lot of good things that you can experience with our amenities. It's been great. It's a really good team. I think we're all very blessed where, you kind of come in and you get to work on products that are experiential. Like people kind of, I guess maybe sometimes you have to remind yourself of that, but it's like people are mostly coming to your building to have a good experience, whether it's like watching their kid take their first steps on ice or, their one night a week to hang out with their buddies and play hockey and go up after for chicken wings and beers. It's a place that's really fun. So I think we try to infuse that into everything we do there. We still have a lot to do kind of on our mission over the next 5 years, as we head into the back half of the 2020s here. But it's been a great role, and I enjoy every second of working there.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm a little familiar with Canlan because I used to be in the beer industry. Okay. So I used to work with Molson, who I know was a big supporter of the Canlan facilities and has been a partnership with the Wild Wings and the restaurants that have been part of it. So I had the business side of it there for a few years over there. But I think it's really cool to work for a facility like Canlan or an organization like Canlan because as a parent now, having been through hockey with my older son who's in U16, and I have a younger son now in U9. Canlan facilities have been a big part of our, last 5, 6, 7 years. Like all the facilities. When I think of the great tournaments that we've been in, some of the best games we've been in, some of the team activities we've had, it's been at a Canlan facility. And actually, if you go back to last season, we actually did we do these like who are or what is, or like a little deep dive. We did one on Canlan not too long ago last season. We talked a little bit about the history there. So I think it's great that you're at Canlan, and kudos to you guys and what you guys are doing. I think the facilities are great, and I think a lot of people that listen to us obviously participate in hockey because they listen to our hockey podcast, but obviously they get to Canlan facilities pretty often. So that's pretty cool job. Yeah.
Is there any chance of a Canlan coming into the east side of the city?
Toronto.
Yeah. That would be nice, wouldn't it? Like
we
maybe
could use a 4-patter.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
that'd be good.
like can we not get something happening there?
Yeah, I hear a few acres of land don't cost very much on this side of the city. So
come on, we can make it happen. We'll charge $4.50 an hour for ice. 4 pads will be with this printing money.
Perfect.
We got that whole Portland's area downtown there. I think it's
make it happen.
Yeah, maybe we can get Olivia to appropriate some land for a nice 4-pattern
for the kids.
Yeah, for the kids. I like it
for the kids.
Question for you: do you guys still own Canlan Etobicoke?
We do, yeah. So that's actually a new naming rights deal with Quench. So we actually have another rink in Burnaby, which is actually an 8-pad sports complex. It's 7 rinks and 1 indoor soccer pitch. That's a naming rights deal with Scotia, so it's called the Scotia Barn. The Quench Center was our newest naming rights deal, so we do still own it. That's an agreement with Quench, and we're certainly excited to have them on board. And they've obviously been able to create quite a bit of buzz with their brand, and I think they're quite happy to have. Etobicoke is probably one of the meccas of youth and adult hockey. Really, we have over 250 ASHL teams that play there as well. So there's a lot of hockey from sort of the very grassroots to like the elite of AAA to the E division of the ASHL happening in Etobicoke.
I feel like one of those guys who still call the Rogers Center Sky Dome because I still Canlan Etobicoke. I haven't moved over yet.
Okay, we'll hope no one from Quench heard that.
Yeah. I know the Quench guy. I used to work with them too, randomly actually. So John Cienza and all those guys I used to work with who run Quench. So when they got that naming right, I thought that was pretty cool for them too. All right, shifting gears again. You got a son. You're in U8 Tornadoes hockey. So you're leading into the GTHL. You got another year, U9. You're going to the GTHL. I think one of the reasons why we're talking here is because one of the conversations Puffy and I have had where I've not been too shy to talk about it is I'm not loving half ice. Mm-hmm. And one of the conversations that brought us together was to talk a little bit about that. So really with the U8 kids, and I know the kids are young and they're getting to know the sport, getting to know how to play, getting to understand the skills, understand and play. So I get the half ice sort of aspect of it. But why don't you give us a little perspective on what you think of sort of that age group and what's important for them, and maybe lead us down if you need to convince us differently on the half ice thoughts there that you have for that U7, U8, U9 age groups.
Yeah, I have some thoughts. I guess the first thing I would say is that I'm a bit of a romanticist for like old rinks. So, we exist now in the era of Clever where I'm sure most people listening to this podcast are familiar with sort of the rise of unsanctioned hockey. Yeah. Obviously, Ted Reeve is still part of the GTHL and still very much part of the GTHL. I'm a romanticist for that. I love like the concept of, playing like in an old barn, especially when you're a little kid. I can still remember some of the first rinks that I grew up in, even playing like outdoors in Winnipeg when I was very young. So, I think when we have a rink like this, like in this neck of the woods, 70 years young now, it's so cool to be able to like carry that tradition forward. And obviously there's been a lot of disruption that could disrupt said tradition. But that's been very much sort of central to a lot of like the driving philosophy for my approach to these age groups, and finding like-minded individuals as well. So to your point, I think like the first way you got to kind of frame it up is like what caliber are these kids, right? So I always look at it where like if you're a tier 1 player, you're mostly on a AA or AAA trajectory, right? That's been disrupted a little bit by Clever, where more of the AAA players have now funneled into Clever, but there's still very much some players in sort of the Hockey Canada's system who are still going to be AAA players. My philosophy on like U7, U8, U9 is I actually have no problems with the concept of modified ice, but I think that the existing approach to modified ice needs some modification. So my take on it is that if you're a tier 1 team, in U7, you should play half. In U8, you should play 3/4. And in U9, you should be playing full for the whole year. If you're a tier 2 or a tier 3 team, and this is where you'd run into some rule sets of like a tier 2 team being like, well, we're a tier 1 because we want to play this format, and trying to be like, no, like your kids are not at that level, so they need to kind of like have a little bit of a different pathway. That's where I think, yeah, sure, maybe you have some cross at tier 2 and 3 in U7, more half in a U8, and maybe you do a 3/4 to full transition in U9. I think conversations like that are happening now. There's been certainly like the NYHL has, I think, pushed the envelope with respect to the 3/4 ice format. For us this year with our team, we have a tier 1 team. I think we can say that we're definitely one of the better teams out there. That's not in sort of the Clever ecosystem at the tier 1 level. We've had a lot of success on the ice this year. We've played most of our games 3/4 ice this year. I think we've played 2 half ice games. I personally think the 3/4 ice format is really good for U8 because you introduce the concepts of 5-on-5, change on the fly, the concepts of positioning come in, but you don't bog the game down with offside and icing yet. Yeah. So the game still remains very frenetic. It tilts quickly. Goalies get a lot of work. It's more physical. I don't know if you guys ever listened to the Hockey Think Tank podcast. It's a podcast from a couple guys in Midwest USA and in Illinois. They had one recently where they're just talking about how you have to introduce concepts of body contact early. And it's like, my guys are lacrosse guys as well. I played lacrosse growing up. Lacrosse at U9 is like a full contact sport.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know that hockey needs to be a full contact sport at this age, but there should be the principles of contact. Like you have to learn how to protect yourself, get your head up, and understand that at a certain point, people are going to hit you. And when you condense the ice size in those age groups, it allows for it. So I think the 3/4 format is really good for U8. And then if you can transition into full ice in U9, I know the OHF's piloting that right now in sort of the Tri-County League west of Toronto.
Okay. It
seems like the rumbling is that that's going to, potentially be the format for U9 next year to move to full ice. So when these 2017s go into their U9 year, I think if you have that pathway, that's a great pathway. And if people want to go to Clever because they really think that their 6 or 7-year-old has to play full ice, that's a choice people can make. I'm a big believer in free market economics. So like if you want to make that choice, hey, the world's your oyster. But I do think that for a lot of people, if you had that pathway where U7 was half at the top level, U8 was 3/4 at the top level, U9 was full at the top level, I think that's a very reasonable and pragmatic development path for your kid.
Do you think if they go to that system, Clever is going to be in trouble?
I don't know if they'll be in trouble because I think that even as the borders have opened up, they haven't opened up in U7, U8, and U9. So when you go in the OMHA, that's still a big lure for Clever where you're not bound to, like, if you live in Newcastle, like you can play with a kid in Whitby if you were playing in the sanction stream at U8 or U9, but with Clever you can. So unless they kind of change that with open borders at the youngest of ages, I don't think Clever really goes away. I also still think that there's a lot of kids who, want to pool and form super teams. I have thoughts on. I really don't think it's a great idea to play on like a absolute juggernaut of a team where you are just curb stomping people at these ages. I think it's important for your kids to face adversity, like understand what it's like to lose and play in tough games. Because eventually when the games matter, when you're in U16, guess what? They're going to be tight, and you need to learn how to like play in that type of game. So I still think some people will look to do that. But yeah, I think over a period of time, like 3 to 5 years, things could start to like they've really like, ebbed in one direction, and they could hit a bit of an inflection point a little bit. But I think it's too early to say. Like there's still a lot of if statements about what could happen that could change that calculus.
Huh. No, it's interesting. I like that idea of what you've laid out of U7, U8, U9. I could live with that. I just feel like as someone who has a U9 kid going into U10 next year, I feel like I've just been playing half ice for so long, and we've just given it up this past week. So we're now on to full ice. But to your point, we haven't really had a lot of training into it. So we are playing a lot of games where there's lots of icing, there's lots of offsides, all those things you just actually mentioned. It just rang true because we've just been playing 2.5 years of half ice,
And that's where, when I look at our team at this point, we're by no means a perfect team, and I don't want them to be a perfect team. They're 7 years old, but you can, even from the start of the year to now, and we got a tournament coming up this weekend in the Amesbury tournament, which is also a 3/4 ice tournament. You start to see it now. It's like people are starting to make passes. They're understanding how to play in traffic. The competitiveness is there. Not every kid has the same, some kids take off and others, stagnate a little bit, and it just sort of is what it is. That's part of coaching, that's part of player development. But overall, on the balance, from the start of the year to now, like you're starting to see it all sort of come to fruition. So I think like this group will be very well prepared to like transition into full ice hockey. I don't think the learning is going to be that significant. And I actually think that a lot of the grit that they kind of pick up in the, 3/4 ice environment will actually benefit them quite well in the full ice environment. It's one of the things when I watch Clever, I watch a lot of hockey at all these ages. And so I've seen a lot of Clever games. I know a lot of people in Clever. I actually find that there's not a lot of grit in it. It's kind of like still a little bit of track meet hockey. I think at the very top echelon of it, you see a lot of really slick puck movement. There's some absolutely phenomenal players, kids who are going to be, dynamite AAA players, at least to start, if not for the entire balance of their AAA run. Mm-hmm. But as you kind of get down a rung, it's like it gets a little choppy. The puck physicality isn't necessarily there because the ice is very big. And it'll be really interesting. It's kind of like being in a live experiment. It'll be interesting to see over the next few years. And it's going to take a few years. Like, I think everybody is very hung up on like what you see this week is the gospel and no one could change my mind. And the reality is, like sit here in 3 years and then kind of look back and say, hey, like, where did this kid play? Where did that kid play? What their trajectory look like? Hey, maybe it could have been different. We'll see.
Yeah. Very cool.
Okay. Well, listen, Scott, we really appreciate you coming on the pod. I think it's been you have such a history and such a you're such rooted in hockey with the U7, U8 team, Canlan, the Soo Greyhounds. So you've had an immense experience with it, and we really appreciate you talking to us. Now, if you listen to the pod, you've been in a lot of situations where you need a pump up song. You got to pump up these U7s, these U8s, or you got to, you're thinking about who you're going to scout, or you're at Canlan and you're putting together the question that we always ask to everybody at the end of it is, what's that song or that pump up song or that type of music that does help you make those decisions or get those teams worked up? Do you have something for the listeners?
For my oldest guy, he's a goalie, and he is very much a goalie profile. He's his favorite goalie in the history of the world is Dominic Hasek.
Nice.
And with the advent of YouTube, he's able to watch copious amounts of Martin Brodeur, Patrick Roy. He's a big Habs fan. He's big right now into 2 Unlimited. He likes the old Rock Up song video. So he's like, throwing some No Limit or Tribal Dance. That's his jam. I would say for me, My two oldest guys are both boys. I have a 2-year-old daughter. She's very much in the Frozen era, so I'm kind of in the Idina Menzel, like Let It Go.
Nice.
That's sort of where I'm at right
Puffy's
now.
favorite.
So,
I love that song.
I've watched Frozen, the first one now. I've seen it about 13 times to actually see the whole movie start to finish, and now we're working on Frozen 2. I think I've seen it 5 times, but I haven't actually seen all the parts of it. So that's where my music vernacular is right now.
Nice. That's great.
The Cars was mine. My kids.
That's a good one too.
You were also Puffy. You were also into was it The Incredibles?
The Incredibles.
Like I went trick or treating with you like 7 years ago, and you dressed up like The Incredibles.
I was Mr. Incredible.
Yeah, you were.
Austin was Dash.
We haven't hit The Incredibles yet in our house, but there was definitely a Cars era a few years ago, and there's some good bangers on that soundtrack.
Oh, that's great.
Life is a Highway. Isn't there like a version of that?
Oh, yeah, Rascal Flatts.
Rascal Flatts.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
So, well, Scott, I really appreciate, both of us really appreciate you coming on the pod and talking to us today. I think it's really interesting. I wish we could ask you some more questions about how you got into being a scout and all those things, but I know we have to, it's getting late here, but really want to thank you for coming on, talking to us about your experience with both scouting, the Canlan, and also with your U7, U8 team. I think it's really an interesting story. So really thank you for coming on to the pod. We appreciate it. And I'm sure we'll see you around Ted Reeve now that I have a face to the name.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks.
Prize often, just so you know. I don't know if you know that.
I have to admit, I went to Ted Reeve yesterday just for the fries.
Just for fries?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not the
neighborhood.
It's not the worst play. Well, I mean, if we can get the view count up, maybe there's like a live pod at some point here in the future.
Yeah.
There's a lot of good brewery establishments here on the East End, so
for sure,
definitely throw that on the roadmap here for 2025. That'd be a good one.
Yes, 100%. Awesome. Well, thanks again for joining us. We really appreciate it, and we'll see you around the rink. Thanks, Scott.
Thanks, guys.
Well, that was a terrific. Like, Scott basically checks every box if you're a minor hockey league parent. Very knowledgeable on the new additions to the GTHL that are coming up through the system, and then he's obviously, as a scout with the Soo Greyhounds, has his pulse and eye on all the top kids at the older ages. So he basically bookends the entire spectrum with minor hockey.
Yeah, it's great to have people like that in the community involved at all the different levels, just because it's such a, he's doing OHL in Canlan, but he brings that sort of knowledge of doing those things down to a U8 team and really gears them up for the years ahead of them. And so it's great to have him. Yeah, we really appreciate him coming on. Very interesting stuff, like way past my knowledge of hockey, that's for sure. It was like, when I was talking to Dan Crosby about BioSteel and a bit about the business, when you and him were talking a bit more, I could feel the vibe of you two having it.
Yes, I definitely feel it was. I was definitely very interested in sort of the behind the scenes stuff that he does with both the Soo Greyhounds, and then just how he's talking about how he's not just following what he's supposed to do with the younger kids. He's trying to, adjust the program that fits those kids in particular.
So anyway, well, thanks again, Scott, for joining. We look forward to having some more interviews throughout the end of the year, and we really appreciate you making the time to come on, and thanks again for doing that. So with that, thanks everyone for listening to the Rink podcast. We really appreciate it. Please DM us, like us, subscribe, share with your friends, write comments, all those great things. We're on all the platforms that are available. Puff, anything else?
No, I'm going to be really interested to see how that Ted Reeve Thunder team comes through the system, the 1 year behind Clive's team. Yeah. You guys are going to have to be calling those kids up when you need them.
Yeah, exactly.
That's actually players on that team.
Well, yeah. True. I guess in U10, when you have to have a call up, can you go to the CDS?
I think you might be able to. Like, once you commit to a team, then that's your team. But I think you could do, as long as you're a year younger.
I haven't even thought about that. Yeah,
you could probably use them as a call-up team. Especially they're the same organization.
If someone knows, please write to us. Let us know. U10 call-ups. How does that work?
Yeah. How does it work?
How does it work? All right. Well, anyway, Stoff, thanks again for doing this. Everyone have a great week in the G. We'll be back soon with another episode of To the Rink podcast. And thanks again for listening.